Hello, everyone, and we're going to get straight into it today because we've got half an hour. We've got some ground we want to cover. Let me just start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where we're all located as we meet today via Zoom and recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters and community. I'm currently on the lands of the Kaurna people in Adelaide. Pay my respects to their elders past, present, and their emerging leaders, and extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us today. Let's introduce this series. It's the first in a series of 6 webinars over the next 3 months. And it came about because I asked a question on LinkedIn about 6 months ago about what was the problem with skills standards and why did people not get the difference between standards. And I got responses from all sorts of people. I got responses from senior executives, from middle management in the vet sector, from consultants, and they all said the same thing. We find the notion of standards and metadata and information science a little too complicated to understand. And I think that leads to a question of, well, let's unpack how we think about skills and skills as things we might define and then use. And today we're going to start with the use side of things. On August the 19th, the very first day of the Productivity Roundtable, which many of us in Australia were watching with a certain intensity, Martin Parkinson, the former Secretary of Treasury and the Department of Premier and Cabinet, who's the chair of the Migration System Review, he said this is a political and economic no-brainer. That's about skills. Everyone here, citizen, resident or new migrant, should have the opportunity to contribute to their maximum ability. Fixing the skills recognition system would improve labour market outcomes for everyone, but better matching would significantly increase the benefits of our migration program. Addressing this issue would provide an almost immediate boost to Australia's economy and improve the impact of the migration program on an ongoing basis. Now, we're not focused on the migration program today, but he did say very clearly, fixing this for everyone, citizen, current resident, and migrants is really important. So today's topic starts at the very beginning, and I'd like to welcome my guest, Yasmin King, who is a co-founder of SkillsAware with me and with others, and also the CEO of SkillsIQ, really significant, experienced CE in the whole skills sector. And Yasmin, I'm always amazed at how many invitations you get to contribute to roundtables and conferences, and everybody wants you on their board or on their discussion point. And I know you've got some really valuable things to talk about. But let's start with skills literacy, if that's okay. And I'm wondering, can we just start with a simple thing about what do you think skills literacy means? And that probably leads to another question, which I'll ask afterwards. But what do you think is skills literacy?
Well, if you ask somebody what their skills are, they tend to define themselves as their current job or their last job. So they think in very narrow terms. And if you try and unpack, well, okay, let's say you're an accountant, okay, and everybody sort of seems to think, oh, well, I know what an accountant does, but do you actually? And if you are the accountant, do you actually know the breadth of the skills that you have involved, but then not only in what your job was, but also what your life-wide skills are. And maybe the best way I can describe this is I had a friend of my son's who had a pretty difficult time at university and he did software engineering. And when he graduated, he expected that he would easily get a job. I mean, because at the time there was quite a lot of demand for software engineers. But he sent out multiple resumes and never ever got any responses. And when we looked at, what he was putting out, he was just putting out his degree, and it wasn't what you would call A class. He'd had some challenges because he'd had some really tragic family circumstances while he was doing his degree. And then he just sort of had, and I am a transport assistant for schools as a part-time job, and that's what I've done all through university. And when I asked him, well, what exactly was that? He said, oh, well, my job was basically, obviously I had to have, first aid, working with children checks. But in addition, what I was responsible for was basically sitting with kids who had severe autism and making sure they got to school and helping them when they arrived, in communicate with the teachers, pass on any issues that the parents wanted me to, and then similarly pick them up from school and took whatever feedback the teachers had and then pass that back to the parents. And I went, oh my God, the skills that you've achieved in doing that part-time work are enormous. Your communication skills, your responsibility, accountability, obviously having to problem solve because these kids' behaviours aren't, linear, et cetera, et cetera. So we completely rewrote his CV. And it was actually on the strength of that he got a job basically providing support to people in cybersecurity, actually helping people understand. And that really, to me, highlights how someone thinks very linear about what their role in life is and not actually about the breadth of what their capability is. And so skills literacy is about helping people articulate the breadth of their capabilities, which obviously also opens up so many more pathways for them. Because, life is not a straight line. I mean, we talk a lot about career planning and people think very lockstep, but in fact, I don't know many people who've actually had lockstep careers. That would be the minority of people I know.
Mm. Yasmin, it's really clear, isn't it? It's about meaning and about language, and they both matter, right? So, but and can I just mention to the side, we do have opportunity for a few questions at the end, and there's a Q&A button on your screen. So please feel free to lodge a question that we may be able to help with shortly. But just picking up on that theme, just going a bit deeper, what is it both about the language and the meaning? Why do people have difficulty understanding and defining their own skills? What is it that makes this difficult, do you think?
Because I think the whole system is so geared to job descriptions and job roles, right? And if you really look at what's happening with AI, I think that's going to be one of the areas where we'll see dramatic change because job roles as we know it are going to evolve quite dramatically. And I'm not suggesting that I can predict the future, and I really quite get frustrated when you hear people say, oh, this is what the future is going to look like. But I think one thing that is pretty clear is that if you're defining your tech skills on the basis of job roles, you're really missing out on a lot of people's broader capabilities. And so I think the whole issue of standards, and it's why I think you got so many responses on your blog post, is that, you can, even if we move to more generic descriptions, right, which is really where I think all qual reform is going, is, let's have more broad categories, like let's have one sort of, track for communication and one for teamwork, et cetera, et cetera. The real risk about that is that, yes, you'll encapsulate everything, but it might mean nothing to no one, right? Because if you look at something like communication has to have a context to it. If you're communicating with somebody who is dying, that is not the same as communicating next to the person, in the office next to you, right? There's a whole different set of nuances and things. And I think that's really why, while I know that there's so many criticisms of the Australian training package system, if you think about it, the fact that it is so broad in terms of its coverage, but incredibly detailed and granular, and think about that not from oh my God, I've got to train against this, but instead think this is metadata, this is information, and it's really granular. So if I want to measure someone against it, this is incredibly rich data, and it's 40 years of history and done, in conjunction with industry for so many years. And that's a massive advantage using a tool like a large language model to evaluate it. and it's skills in context, right? Which is fantastic, right?
It's detailed context, right? Too, like
Detailed
trades and
context,
all sorts.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think that's where, it's basically taking something that everybody sees as a problem and flipping it on its head and saying, hang on a minute, this is a real opportunity. And I think, Mark, that's what we've done with SkillsAware, is recognise that and say, well, okay, this is here. How do we actually leverage it? And then put it in a form that's of meaning to basically, let's face it, who that's got to be. That's employers who at the moment are seeing perfect AI generated CVs. They're then being evaluated by AI. And now, increasingly, even first and second round interviews are being done by AI chatbots. So, I mean, could you depersonalize any more what is actually one of the most critical decisions you make? And that is making sure that you're hiring the right person for the role.
Yeah. And that leads to this conversation about skills-based hiring and resourcing. I mean, people don't do very few people do traditional jobs these days. And, I think it's even acknowledged in all sectors by employers and unions. It came up in this first day. It's actually really a pity for me that the press didn't really well report on this first consensus around skills. They reported on housing and all the other things out of the productivity roundtable, all the other questions, but they didn't really report on this consensus there was about freeing up the skill system, where there's general agreement across employers and unions and everybody that we need to be better at this. And as you say, resumes, what do you think about resumes? Just unpacking that a bit further. You just mentioned their applicant tracking systems and AI. I mean, is the resume dead, do you think? Has it always been inadequate? What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I mean, I think it's going to be a while before it's irrelevant, but certainly what we're hearing from employers is that they rely less and less on actually going through that process and are going back to the old school. Hey, Mark, do you know anyone? I'm looking for someone who can do this job. They're looking for that verification from a person that the person is there. Or I think the other massive problem we have is they look for someone who's done exactly the same role in another company, right? And if you want innovation, how are you going to get innovation, right? It's also not particularly satisfying for the person who's going from one job to another if they're doing exactly the same thing, just in a different culture. So I don't think it's dead. And even all the narrative about skills-based hiring, I mean, Harvard did a study a year or so ago where they found that while people have adopted that narrative, yes, we're doing skills-based hiring, they're still falling back to using data based on job descriptions, traditional CVs, putting out traditional job descriptions. So I think it's an evolving thing. But if we want things to change, and look, let's bear in mind, we've had so much reform in both vet and now in higher ed. And if you look at, I mean, we recently moved offices and I could have taken reports that were written 20 years ago, changed the time and cover and re-released it. And it says all of the same things that we're talking about now, right?
And yet things haven't moved, right?
And things have not moved.
Yeah. And you and I talk offline about this. So I'd like to share something of our offline conversations around this piece, because I love your insights around this. The real question is what the impacts would be if we did get this right. But before we go there, and later in this series, we're going to do a lot more detailed unpacking of the kind of technocracy, right? Like what technologies, what is meaning? How does the information science work? We're not doing that today. We're just opening up the conversation. But, comparing apples with oranges, it's a classic problem. Getting the language right and the meaning right, it's difficult, isn't it? What do you think would be the impact if we go too generic, right? That, just picking up a theme you mentioned before, like, do you think we'd get more of the right people in the right jobs? Or do you think that that's just satisfying the people who find the information science a bit complex?
Look, I think we're so focused on the supply side and not the demand side, right?
Yeah.
And because, and that's the economist in me coming out, and the supply side is about basically how do we get volume, right? So how do we scale training delivery? How do we basically, the narrative currently of, what we need to do is shorten courses, right? Make them, make the barriers to basically getting qualification. I mean, even the Productivity Commission is talking about, well, let's remove some of the licensing requirements. Hairdressing is a classic one where they've said, oh, New South Wales has got, requirements for you to be licensed as a hairdresser. An interestingly, media article that talked about someone who basically had trained in the UK. They didn't have a qualification, but they'd physically worked as a hairdresser for 10 or so years in the UK and moved to Australia and said, oh, and in Victoria, I just walked in and got a job, right? Because there isn't a license. And okay, that for me, so let's formally recognise your qualifications. You've been working at it for 10 years. So let's make sure we do an RPL so that someone have confidence. Because for me, the risk of saying, let's open the doors and have more people do it. And if someone does it badly, there'll be some consequences, but they'll probably only do it once or twice. I think about it so much from the consumer point of view, and that person who has a dreadful haircut from somebody who doesn't know what they're doing, or has a dye job where half their hair falls out or whatever, that to me is unacceptable, right? So I think, and it's also deprofessionalizing something that is professional, right? I mean, I certainly wouldn't suggest that I can cut anybody's hair. That would be, and doing it in a way that is sufficient and appropriate. So for me, I think this notion of making everything easier so that we get more supply is fundamentally flawed. We need to make sure we have quality. My thing for making things a faster pathway is recognise the skills people already have from their life-wide experience, and that's what's going to shorten the pathway. Not say, hey, let's do a free-for-all and make it just easier, because that's not right. And I don't think, and certainly employers don't want that. I mean, all we hear from employers is they want people who've got specific skills. They don't want someone who basically says, well, I've got some broad skills and, hopefully, because they also don't have the capacity for somebody in a tight labour market to basically spend a lot of time upskilling someone. That's just the reality.
These are interesting big questions, aren't they? Like, here's a good example because you clearly need a more detailed, licensed, regulated hairdresser than I do, right? I could just do with someone with some clippers and I'm fine. So the point about it is context does matter. And as you say, the consumption side really, really matters. And therefore you need the detail, right? So you've got to have some understanding of what things mean. I wonder, do you think we're a little bit focused, like this thing about opening up licensing versus fraudulent qualifications and backgrounds? Do you think we've got the pendulum the wrong way in that question? Because clearly you can't have it both ways. If you're going to make it a bit easier, it is going to open up, people, we need better ways of verifying people's experience in history, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and I think it's also got to be in a form that is actually meaningful to employers, right? Yeah. So, I think you often talk about, who wants the 1,000-line resume, right? Okay. It's not going to mean anything to anyone. No. So it's really about how can you have a mechanism so that somebody can look at, these are the skills that I need someone to have. How can you present me the information to give me evidence that you have those skills? And, one of the areas that I see is an enormous amount of frustration is compliance training, right? In, for example, the disability space, every organisation has got compliance training. And some of the stats I've heard of the churn of people where, they've moved from one employer to another. And this is a highly casualised workforce too, with a lot of contractors. And one of the first things they're told when they're recruited into a new organisation is, okay, you've got to do our, 5-day compliance training. They go, well, hang on a minute, I just did this 3 months ago at my other job. I'm not going to do this again, and they quit. And one organisation was telling me they lose 13% of all people, they've just recruited on the first day because they refused to do that compliance training again. If they had a way of actually having assured information as to what compliance training that person has done previously and evidence of that, then they might say, okay, these are the gaps you need to do, but we're not going to make you do the whole thing again. And all of that also prevents someone from actually having time to upskill because they're just doing the same stuff over and over again.
Well, and so this is the importance of data standards, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So that we can have systems that are interoperable. People can transfer from state to state, side to side, job to job, and take their skills with them in a standardized form. This is where you're heading with this idea. I mean, would that revolutionize people's career outcomes just generally, do you think?
Well, I think if somebody could understand when someone says, I've got communication skills working in the disability sector, for example, and that was to a standard which was transparent, that's very different from me writing a CV and saying, hey, I can do this, and even more so if that I've got this measured against a standard and here's peer references and here's a supervisor's reference and I can show you all of that and it's in and I'm in control of that. I have access to that. So, as opposed to I'm reliant on someone uploading it for me, right? Which is much more a supply side. So this gets down to this fundamental philosophical position of who should own the data and whose data is it and who should basically be responsible for maintaining it and updating it. And I would argue it needs to be the individual. Sure, an employer might basically sponsor that and support it and, maybe fund it for some time. But at the end of the day, if you really want people to be responsible for lifelong learning, they need to control the data of it.
And this skills information needs to be in a digital form, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Because that's what allows you to move it around between different situations,
I mean, if I think about how many expensive training courses I've done in my corporate career, and if you said, can you provide me with evidence? And okay, I'm at risk of showing my age. They're all lovely certificates. I would not have a clue where they are. I would not even be able to remember the names of half of it. But if instead I'd been given digital certification of it and I had it in some sort of a wallet, then it would be a completely different thing, wouldn't it? Right.
Now, I've got one question on our Q&A, but there's room for more. So we're just going to go to a bit of a question time if we can. And please, if you're listening on and have a question, please put one on the Q&A. The first one I've got is, what's the role of government in this, do you think?
Look, there's the ideal position, but then let's look at what practical reality is. Now, we know that there's a desire to recreate to do a new taxonomy. And I think, you and I have had many conversations, okay, another dictionary, okay. The reality is, though, if you want to do this across, and as they're talking all levels of education, I'd suggest having been specifically involved in just trying to agree a transition between vet and higher ed from enrolled nursing to nursing, and we did consultation on that for a year and basically could not get anyone to agree. I'd suggest the aim of trying to do this across 3 levels of the education system and agreeing on one thing is boiling the ocean.
Yeah. So maybe the role of government is to look at standards and get adoption of standards rather than problem solving. Maybe there needs to be a shift from the emphasis. I don't know. What do you think?
Look, I think it's like in health, for example. if you look at what the adoption is of health transparency systems that the government has spent lots of money funding, it's been incredibly poor because it's centralised and it's very much provider driven, right? So, and it's opt out, right? So many people do not, for example, subscribe to my health record and don't intend to, right? Because it's their data and they want to control who has access to it, okay? And also, it's very centralised and top-down control. Whereas what I would argue is you'll get far more take up and support if you go the other direction, right? And where government's role should be is in saying, you know what, if you want to engage with us, these are the standards that need to be met, right? Now, that's starting to happen in health in terms of operability of health systems, but the government is now only just starting to do that. But that means there is a whole plethora of, for example, health record management systems out there that are all proprietary, right? So that transition to what an open standard is going to be is probably going to take 20 years.
Yeah, that's so tough, and it might take longer than we think in the skills area too.
Absolutely.
But I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're saying there's much more benefit in this being market-driven, consumer side-driven, if we can find a way to make that happen.
Absolutely. And I think one of the challenges is that a lot of the tech solutions are very much, here's a piece of technology. We're going to basically now make this fit what we see as a need in that skills and the talent management space, instead of what actually is the wicked problem that needs to be solved and how do we design something to actually solve that and use technology. And the two things are very, very different.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, the way that I've been in the EdTech game a long time, the way it works is often it's the big institutions, the big programs that have got the money to pay for the tech. So the tech becomes oriented toward the institution and the government program rather than the consumer in this field. And I think it's a dilemma because someone's got to fund this stuff. But well, I think as we're starting to draw to a conclusion, and this is great because what you've done is given us the economic rationale for standards in skills, which is a great lead into this webinar series because we'll start to unpack the detail. But finding ways of moving from subjectivity to objectivity in this is a key thing, don't you think?
Absolutely, absolutely. And also, you can't dismiss issues of data privacy and storage, right? And what worries me about a lot of the narrative of AI is, and particularly if you're using, is where is the data being stored and how is it being stored? And is it being stored in basically an AI system, which is hugely problematic, right? As you well know. And I think we've got to, and again, it's that, people are having less and less confidence when they hand over their data to big systems as to how well it's being protected.
Well, that leads to the great last question I've got here, and thanks, Chris, for this question. What about the human factors? Is it just going to be, we're going to have automated systems that, just identify skills and republish them and so on and so forth? What about the human factors in this? Is there still a place for people?
That I read recently about an organisation that did a way of basically recruiting students that was all AI emphasis, and they've just shut down because basically students said, we actually want to talk to somebody, right? I want to talk to a person. And in the case of, I think, what we've recognised in the whole, and having spent the last year working on interfaces and data standards in the skill space, what's really, really clear is that this notion that you can completely eliminate humans out of the system is flawed, right? There has to be ultimately at the end an experienced trainer and assessor who's the ultimate person who's going to be able to go through that RPL process. This is about taking away some of that laborious administrative part. But to say that an AI is going to be able to write your courses, evaluate your courses, basically RPL you, if somebody is selling you that, I wouldn't be walking, I'd be running the other direction.
So it is about standardising and making objective what we can, and
Correct.
leaving the subjective assessments for the context and so on. So, and if I can summarise, what I hear you saying is we need to standardise both the skill statements, or make them so that you can map them, and also the context in which they exist. And if we can create some national standards that do those two things, then we're going to make some progress. But to summarise again, I hear you saying it needs to be granular.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the really ironic thing is that Australia has the most comprehensive, granular set of standards, right? I mean, and it's national. So why would you throw that out?
Yeah, that's a great way to end. Thanks, Yasmin, for being my guest today on this first in a series about skills and standards. And thanks for all of our guests who came along today. The webinar recording will be available afterwards. And you can get in touch with us through www.skillsaware.com. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. See you, Mark.
Bye.